levels charges in the use of artillery in Bankovats, Obrovats, and Grachats. That use of artillery caused civilian deaths and injuries. And I know the Chamber look and examine that evidence of civilian deaths and injuries in Bankovats, Obrovats, and Grachats, which the prosecution mentions in paragraphs 138, 484. And examine that evidence to see what the deaths and injuries were. Unfortunately, the Chamber will look in vain, because when leveling those allegations against the accused, most particularly against General Gotovine, there is no evidence of any civilian deaths, injuries in Bankovats, Obrovats, and Grachats. So what we learn from the brief that is filed by the prosecution, that merely because it is said, one need to check the accuracy of that. And it is not only what is said that needs to be questioned when it comes from the prosecution, but what is not said. Unfortunately, silence is often sacrificed in the pursuit of the truth. And then when in alleging that virtually the entire political, civil, and military structure of Croatia was involved in a joint criminal enterprise to ensure that the Serb population was not allowed to come back to Croatia, never once in a 300-page brief, never once in 6 hours of argument, never once does the prosecution comment about the prosecutor, Mr. Galovic, who testified to this chamber in February of 1996 that had processed 1,277 cases in the wake of Operation Storm by February of 1996. The question to be asked by the chamber is why? Why would the prosecution fail to mention that? Is he, as termed in their brief at paragraph 5, just simply one of the many JCE members who were too numerous to mention? Or is there some reason that these inaccuracies and these omissions are merely sacrifices on the altar of a conviction? I turn my attention to the allegations concerning General Gotovine as it pertains to the JCE. And I direct the Chamber to the factors set forth by the prosecution in paragraph 121 of its brief. Factor 1 of paragraph 121 is that General Gotovine shared the common criminal purpose of the JCE by allegedly planning, ordering, and implementing a widespread and systematic unlawful shelling attack against the Serb civilian population with the specific purpose of driving that population out. These comments will be addressed in parts of the brief filed by the prosecution and also comments presented by Mr. Russo yesterday. This use of artillery is the core of the prosecution's Brioni JCE theory, which depends upon proof of widespread or systematic unlawful shelling. While a centerpiece of the prosecutor's JCE theory, there is simply no evidence to support the theory. The evidence demonstrates that the HV's use of artillery during Operation Storm was consistent with widely accepted military doctrine, not only on the NATO level, not only on the Dutch Army level, not only on the American level, but throughout militaries in the world. And this is precisely what the Gotovine defense told the Chamber during our opening statement which is at page 573, lines 6 through 24. While this is extensively covered in our brief at pages 50 through 86, Your Honors, and I will not obviously go through that, taking the admonition from the Chamber not to re-argue that which is in our brief. I must comment on some of the arguments that were brought before this Chamber by Mr. Russo yesterday. My page references to the transcript yesterday, Mr. President, and Your Honors, are to the raw copy simply because there was no final copy available last night while this preparation was underway. So my apologies in that regard. At page 47 of yesterday's transcript, line 24 through 48, line 24 through page 48, line 3, Mr. Russo argued, quote, "No amount of artillery jargon about center of gravity or full-spectrum operational dominance or air-land battle or the maneuverist approach or any other military doctrine justifies the wild discrepancies between the alleged targets of attack and the actual evidence of what was shelled in Canine." Now, first and foremost, Mr. Russo at no point in the brief for yesterday attempts to discuss any of those accepted military approaches, because they are just that, accepted military approaches that are counter to the position taken by the prosecution. Next, Mr. Russo then showed the Chamber a slide overlaying circles of where witnesses claim to have seen shells or rocks land at some point during storm, along with 11 military targets identified by Mr. Reichich. Now, if we could put this on sanction for a moment. This is the slide that was referred to yesterday by Mr. Russo. Now, the prosecution asked the Chamber to infer from this slide that the only reasonable interpretation of the evidence is that the entire city of Canine was made the object of attack. This slide is not only not probative of that point, it's probative of virtually nothing. When looking at this, consistent with what the Chamber has done in cases like Golovich, questions are manifold. The first question is whether the recollection of witnesses in the midst of this combat as to where shells allegedly landed was accurate, and in fact landed in these various areas circled in the map of Canine. The next question, of course, would be if the circles of these witnesses were correct, the Chamber would need to know the concentration of fire, of impact within these circles, for it to be probative of anything. How many shells fell in these circles? 1? 50? 100? Further, the Chamber would need to know within these circles where the shells impacted relative to military targets. These questions could have and should have been answered, as it was in other cases such as Golovich, by evidence of damage within these circles. Crater analysis, damage assessments, videos, photographs, all as pieces of evidence presented to other trial chambers in support of an illegal shelling charge, none of which has been presented here. Based on the prosecution's slide and its statement yesterday that no less than 1,000 artillery shells were fired into Canine over the course of a 25-hour artillery campaign, and again that's page 48 of yesterday's transcript, lines 13 to 14, the Chamber would have expected to have been presented with photographs, videos, and damage assessments in the city of Canine, and that Canine that have been virtually leveled as a result of this artillery attack. Further, the Chamber would have expected to have received dozens of crater analyses, as well as a disproportionate number of civilian casualties and deaths. The Chamber would not have expected to see evidence that the artillery use was concentrated against military objectives, as outlined by my colleague, Mr. Misicic, as we saw, a provisional and final assessment of damage caused by artillery use by Senior Steiner Hertness, the report of UN CivPol, the reports of senior international diplomats, U.S. code tables, and a U.S. Secretary General report to the Security Council. This evidence is detailed at paragraphs 306 to 313 in our brief. Additionally, Your Honors, and this was before it was manipulated by Mr. Roberts, the Chamber would not have expected to see General Ferrand tell the Canadian military in June of 1996 that the HV's use of artillery excellent. And that's at P401, page 21. All of the evidence is consistent with the conclusion that the use of artillery was lawful. The fact that the prosecution did not corroborate any widespread destruction in Canine with photographs, videos, damage assessments, crater analysis, and disproportionate civilian casualties is not just because they waited 3 months into the trial to file a motion seeking artillery documents from Croatia. If this prosecution's interpretation was correct, this type of evidence would have been easily obtainable by the UN and given to the OTP back in 1995. It was not. The reason why it wasn't given to the OTP back in 1995 because it didn't exist, and this after-the-fact interpretation by the prosecution is simply wrong. To the possible question, that the OTP did not have the opportunity to investigate this in August of 1995, I addressed the Chamber to P378, which is an UNMO report. The OTP has been investigating this case since 29 August 1995, when Mr. Todd Cleaver of the Office of the Prosecutor visited Canine to meet with various UN personnel. Had this evidence existed of this widespread, unlawful attack against the civilian population in Canine, it is simply implausible that the evidence would not have been given to Mr. Cleaver at that time. With respect to the crater analysis and the lack thereof, the prosecution has offered only one crater analysis throughout this entire case. As discussed in paragraph 318 of our brief, this analysis was shown to have been from a Serbian rocket fired into Canine on 5 August. I'm sure Your Honor recall that testimony coming from Mr. Monkilian and Mr. Antilla, as well as their report, which showed that this rocket was found in 3 separate locations. But nevertheless, the rocket itself was a Serb rocket, an ARSK rocket. Rather than accept this reasonable interpretation of the evidence, in the prosecution's zeal, the prosecution now claims, and I kid you not that this is in fact the position that they take, the prosecution now claims in paragraph 605 of its brief that HV forces seized MRLs at 8:55 from the ARSK and then decided to fire on their own troops who entered Canine by 10 o'clock on the 5th of August. This is another example of just wide, vacuous speculation on behalf of the prosecution. There is no evidence to substantiate that allegation at all. Next, during Mr. Russo's presentation, he sweepingly dismissed accepted military doctrine as jargon and failed to apply the doctrine into evidence. This is because, in our brief at paragraphs 235 to 250, we've